Okay, so couple of skims, and I'll admit that's kind of what I was doing too, but with a little more attention focused on the research and evaluation section. So good to know. Okay, I got our recording all set to go. So Renae, thanks for joining us today, and maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about how the guidelines were developed.
Yeah. So this document came out of, and the discussions after an AAM session in, I think, 2013. And it was primarily LGBTQ museum professionals and a few allies talking about their experiences, either as professionals or as visitors, and being unwelcome in informal learning spaces. And a colleague of mine who is a registrar at Cal Academy said, what we really need is we need an equality index for museums. And what that is, that's referring to a document called the Corporate Equality Index, which the Human Rights Campaign publishes every year. That's basically the corporate social responsibility of America's large companies regarding LGBTQ staff support and protections, community engagement efforts, marketing practices, all kinds of things that add up to, are they a good citizen to that community? And that kicked off a discussion of what would that look like? How would that happen? And a small group of people became sort of a task force of the LGBTQ Alliance Professional Network within AAM. So akin to CARE, right, for this community, that scale and size of group, and started working on how would we do something? What would that look like? And basically, we knew we wanted it to be both an information resource, and that's why you see things like all these recommendations and a glossary and a bibliography, right? And also have an element of self-assessment to it. So people in institutions at any level could sort of gauge where they were versus where they might like to be in terms of being a more welcoming space for particular communities. And the strategic choice we made at that point was to create two different sort of lenses of alignment in the document. One was to align it to the American Alliance of Museums. It's not standards of excellence or something like that, but basically the framework of professional practice that AAM puts out across museum practice generically. And that's where you get some of the first set of chapters in the document is aligning to those standards and areas of museum practice. But there were things that are missing in that document that we wanted to make sure to call out specifically around particular roles within a museum or functional areas of practice. And so we added a second set of sections. And you'll see, if and when you get a chance to do a close read, that some of the specific recommendations repeat from one section to another because they apply from one section to another. But we really wanted to structure it so that people could find really as many entry points as they wanted to be able to find some action to take to make some effort to have a more welcoming institution. So that's sort of the origin story, the development in practice, a small team of folks, either who were part of the professional network or who we solicited to bring into the fold, ended up being authors on these sections. And we did them, because it was sort of a big lift and there were not a ton of people, we did them in 2 years. So 5 or 6 or 7 in the first year and the remainder in the second year of the 12. And so we had authors put together a draft, and then those drafts went out to, I think, all total, something like 40 reviewers looked at some portion of this document to give a second set of eyes and feedback about language recommended practices and the alignment of different things between the sections. And all of the people who were involved in the process, their qualifications ranged from being people with an area of academic study and interest in LGBTQ people in museums, to self-identified museum professionals who were drawing on their own personal and professional experience, to sort of everything in between. So a whole range of different kinds of expertise, and then each of those authors and reviewers had additional expertise in whatever the content or job function area or areas they were looking at. If anyone wants a really exhaustive written summary of that process, we actually were invited to share that origin story in much longer, more detailed form in an article in Museums and Social Issues that was published last fall. I can find the citation or the text if anyone is really, really interested. But that's how it came to be, and that's how we're hoping people start to use it. We did some interviews this spring with institutions at different points in their welcoming practices journey, some using this document as a resource and some not, to kind of try and get an idea of how implementation works in practice. I currently have that stack of interviews sitting on my desk at home. So we'll see what comes out of that. You all know how that goes.
Awaiting analysis.
Yeah. And sort of the long-term future of this document has a couple of tracks. One to go deeper into supporting people around implementation and what that looks like for different institutions, what might be common across institutions. And the other is spreading the reach of the document itself. So the professional network actually just had a committee call yesterday, and we got confirmation that this document has now, in the year or so since we released it, it's been translated into Spanish. That's complete. The translation into French in progress. And it's been taken up and being considered for adaptation and adoption where relevant by the Canadian Museums Association.
Great.
So expanding the reach of these different practices as much as we can. So that's the overview.
I'm curious, is anyone that's present on our Hangout today using these guidelines in any capacity in your institution or organization? Or do you have other guidelines that you're working on as part of this mission to be more welcoming to LGBTQ audiences or other communities? I can start off just with our own organization, Rockman et al. We're not a museum. Obviously, we're an independent evaluation and research firm. But we do have questions arise sometimes about, at least developing some sort of standard practice for survey questions that deal with gender and things of that nature. But we don't have any standards in place at the moment. It tends to change from one project to the next and one client to the next, which I feel like is a tricky situation because it would be nice to have some more guidance or a principle to turn to on something as simple as asking about gender on a survey. But we still have this need to be flexible on our projects. So that's sort of as close as we get at the moment to implementing something like this in our work.
Hi, this is Lisa. I work at the Lawrence Hall of Science. I emailed out the guidelines to our equity committee, which is its purpose has been in flux a lot over many years, but one of our purposes is to provide professional learning opportunities for staff. And I felt like it would, like, it's a resource that we, in terms of like how could we use this in our institution? And unfortunately, that conversation never really got moving. And so, like, I would be interested in thinking about like how to, going from people, some people not even really being familiar with AAM, because the hall is not just a museum. We do lots of other kinds of things too. And so some of the folks on the equity committee don't even work with the museum specifically. But thinking about how to maybe like introduce the document in an organization and kind of talk about it and kind of how to start small with it to get the conversation going.
This is Lee with the Ohio History Connection, and folks here, we actually have people whose jobs are focused on relating to different audiences, and so they went to AAM and found this document, even though I emailed it out a long time ago, and they're ready to like start testing, and so they came back and had heard some ideas about what to do, and so they're ready to start, but I'm not sure where to direct them. So they're actually ready to start bringing in the community and having them do activities, and I'm not sure that's the best place to start. So that's where we are. So there's lots of buy-in, but there's a question about first steps.
That's awesome, Lee. I think a lot of what we're hearing from people in other institutions is the opposite of that, right? That we actually had a long discussion on a call yesterday about someone who wants to tackle some implementation steps, but literally is getting like schoolyard giggling and taunting from C-suite staff and board about why would we do this if they're not a protected class and we don't have to, and it also sort of makes us uncomfortable. Why would we do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've had a dialogues on inclusivity for a year and had different audiences come in and talk to us, and so that's part of our strategic plan, and it's something that we're really focused on.
That's awesome.
We have a good relationship with different communities.
So
they don't come here, but we go out to them.
Yeah. So it sounds like for both you and Lisa, having more sort of infrastructure around it is a really good, I mean, sort of duh, right? But a really good entry point to implementing these.
Right. Do we start with a self-assessment? Do we start with, having the community come in? I mean, where's the recommendation for where to start?
Yeah.
Have Renae, in the work you've done, have certain strategies been more successful than others for first introducing this document to other individuals at the institution or higher ups?
I don't know enough about things on the ground to say for sure. There's my disclaimer. I think there's in general, I think the biggest first step has been talking about why for a lot of institutions, and I think the people in this virtual room are here because we're past that a little bit, right? That they're looking for something more than just, well, what is this thing and why should I care? But I think lots of the field is there, so that's where I'm doing a lot of thinking. Like in the script for the interviews that we conducted this spring, there was a lot of focus on what have the barriers been, who have the barriers been, are there champions in your institution, and what is that, and kind of really thinking about getting the door open in the first place. So I personally am not thinking and hearing a lot yet about more than that. I know my colleague whose bright idea this was, her name is Annette Gavigan, if any of you say who might live just up the road. want to get in touch, they did a full, like, intensive 4 or 5 meeting reflection self-assessment process. That's I think she started with an orientation to this document and then worked in different levels of reflection and articulating, well, what are we doing? What should we be doing? What could we be doing in different areas as a staff process with sort of the people who were already on board. And is very fortunate to be in an institution that, number one, has the resources and person power to do that, and number two, has the leadership support to do that. So, yeah, I think, I don't know, I think the things that will be or will feel easiest or most doable as initial steps are probably different for every institution.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But hopefully there are some for every institution in this document. And what the low-hanging fruit is, or what the most high return on investment thing is. I could see, sort of, Lee, to your point about that tension of what do we do first, that using community voices to identify what the most high impact first or next steps might be could be a really valuable thing. Like if a document like this is already framed in terms of professional practice, then bringing in the things a community really values, or the institution specific audience really values, kind of meets in the middle, right? I'm making this up, but what do you guys think of that? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think so. I wonder, so I'm looking at this list of discussion questions that we generated, and maybe in building an argument for using a document like this is showing that our audiences are diverse. And so I was wondering if you know if there's any information available on percentage of museum attendees who identify as LGBTQ, since we know other demographic information about museum audiences, but I'm wondering if there's any reliable statistics on LGBTQ audiences, just to show that they are coming to museums and therefore are an audience we need to think about serving and welcoming.
If any of you know of any, I would love to hear about it. I haven't encountered any yet.
Don't you think that if you use the census data of the percentage of people, it's like you go with the percentage of population, that we know that they're coming to our museums as is any other percentage? I mean,
you could if that were in the census.
Don't they have domestic partners now, or?
Yeah, but that only captures people who are in some sort of legally validated relationship.
Right.
Might say they're in a head of household. Like there's you miss basically anybody who's not in a long-term 2-person relationship if you use census data right now. And actually, because the world we're living in, opportunities across all kinds of big government data collection opportunities to self-identify as LGBTQ are being stripped out. So the ones that were there in elder care and health surveying, the latest guidance this spring has been to remove those questions. So we're going backwards instead of forwards in that regard.
Yeah, or you could use the what is this, the American Public estimates of 25%.
Yeah.
Of the population. I mean, is that a way to do it, is to look at the numbers of percentage of population?
In absence of something better, I think absolutely, yeah. The closest thing I could find and recall about this is I go back to So one of the very, very early issues of Museums and Social Issues from, I think it's 2008, the title of the issue, it was "Where is Queer?" And it was a whole LGBTQ museum experience focused topical issue. And Everybody Loves Joe. Our dear friend Joe Heimlich and Judy Koch wrote about a pilot study, and maybe this is something you already know, Lee. This is the only thing I could find. But that they took a sort of convenience population from a university alumni LGBT group and asked them, do you go to museums? And about their behavior, about their perceptions of feeling welcome or comfortable in those settings, and actually did a comparison to performing arts venues. And they found pretty robust participation, not as a percentage of all visitors, but I wish I could strengthen it with more studies, that they were vastly, vastly underrepresented among subscribers and members and donors. Like down, the numbers fell from that 40-50% range of attending and participating down to 2-3-5% member and subscribers. So there's something there, yeah, right? There's something there, but that's the only, I don't know that anyone has replicated that study or expanded on it in a museum or any kind of cultural sector specific context.
Mm-hmm. My internet cut out for a second there, but I think I caught the gist of the last couple of minutes, and I think that museums and social issues issue would be a great one to share, and so maybe we can look that up after the call today and send that around by email, because I would definitely be interested in reading more about that. I also want to read out Chris's comment from earlier. I'm curious how this topic fits in with any other trainings that your teams may be considering. For example, the Science Center has at least half a dozen topics that are all priority: hospitality, diversity, inclusion, enhancing access, management training, performance management, de-escalation of conflict situations. So yeah, if any of our institutions touch on this in any other trainings or initiatives that are going on. And I can say for our small organization, not at the moment. Although we do have those, Jen, it's slipping my mind what we're calling them, working groups. And I can see this being a really good topic for a working group. It also sounds like maybe, thanks for sharing that, Renae. The issue of the where is queer issue of museums and social issues is shared in the chat window for anyone who is interested. I think it would be really interesting to try to get a large variety of institutions to implement some sort of survey on this topic. I can also see a lot of pushback on that being possible. But one thing, and Lisa said she wants to do a member survey in the next year. I think it would be totally cool. One concern for myself as someone who doesn't identify as LGBTQ is how do you implement something like this without offending this community or making it seem as if you're just trying to get information from them without necessarily handing something back, or and how do you assure them that it's not a tokenizing effort?
Yeah. Well, so an easy way to not have someone feel like you're taking something without handing something back is to hand something back, right? And that's hard in a consulting space, but I think for those of us who are in institutions, it becomes easier and it becomes part of a relationship building process. There's a softball as someone also not working in an institution.
Yeah, Lisa, maybe you could share some of your ideas for what the survey might look like or how you might implement it. Have you given some thought to those things?
Wait, sorry, was that for me?
Yeah.
Okay. Not really. I mean, so in addition to doing evaluation and such now, I am also membership manager. And so in general, I want to do a survey. And so I'm kind of like brainstorming about all the different kinds of things to talk about. And one thing actually that like kind of came out of sharing the welcoming guidelines with the equity committee is I wanted to ask the equity committee for some ideas about how to change our membership categories to be more inclusive, because they always are framed around families. And so thinking about like how that thinking can be tied into the survey and thinking about like who members are and just how to not alienate people and maybe make people feel like they are not the type of people who become members, or just kind of, it's not a part of it that I've thought much about yet, but I feel like it would be good to include a little something. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have thoughts about what that could look like in terms of what we're focusing on today?
This is Lee. For us, this initiative started from trying to get, we've had for a while a Gay Ohio History Initiative where we've done a collecting plan with the community. And so this wasn't our first interaction with the community. So we partnered with Outlook Magazine here and began through the community to begin to collect their history. So we've already had a relationship. So it wasn't like the first approach was, hey, we want you to feel welcome. Instead, it was, we've had this initiative, which has had its ups and downs. I mean, sometimes our collecting's been better than others. We've had some scanning events where people can bring things in they don't want to let go of, and we've scanned them. We go out into the community, like we'll be at every single Pride festival, have a presence there. So, but the dialogues on inclusivity have been around. It started as a way to get to know the tribes that have been removed from Ohio that we have a relationship with, building a relationship and understanding different cultures. So we've asked a lot of different folks to come in, and it's an optional brown bag that we have. And it's just been really well attended by folks, just trying to hear from people from all these different communities, what their lives are like, what their issues are, what works for them, what doesn't. And so building relationships that way. So that's been an optional thing for us, but it's been really well attended. We've actually talked about putting those out there so other people can access them. But I think we're meeting about that next week, wondering if other museums would be interested in it. But, it's like an hour-long thing where people come in and just talk to us about their community.
Thanks for sharing, Lee. I wanted to go back to Renee's provocative question she's posted. Do community relationships have to be related to museum content?
I don't have an answer, but I dare you all to come up with one.
I can definitely see how something like, an upcoming exhibition or something that you're seeking formative feedback and input on is a good starter for a relationship. But I guess I would hope that wouldn't be the only occasion on which you would seek a relationship with the community.
Another launching point to relationships that aren't content-based is potentially looking in-house first, which is not to say like make your gay friend who works in exhibits do this work for you, but like doing a climate survey and soliciting in a whole institution's existing community relationships that might be one-on-one or built around non-work service could reveal some entry points.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to some of our discussion questions about the internal culture and training at museums, and a climate survey like that. I think that was one of the recommendations in the guidelines, and I'm curious if anyone's institutions or groups has done something like this, or otherwise like internal training on LGBTQ sensitivity. I don't think I've ever worked somewhere that did.
Me neither.
The hall had kind of like a climate survey light that was conducted by a consultant, kind of more in an HR response kind of thing to like clues that things were not super great. But since then we haven't, like, something we've talked about, but there are no internal resources to do because of like how our HR system is structured and like what people's roles are. We haven't done formed some other climate survey that we can give regularly to note like what is the baseline in measurable terms instead of just themes, and then being able to measure whether there's improvement based on whatever we implement, training or other strategies to improve the climate. And so I don't know, like, for us, it's a huge struggle of how to move something like that forward because it's not in anyone's job description, nor does anyone necessarily have sufficient time to be able to like that. And so for me, at least, it feels like a huge gap, and I have lots of feelings about it, and the fact that I feel like it's so important and yet we can't really do it. And yeah, so I feel like I have a question about, because like as an evaluator, like I have skills that could contribute to this thing, but it's actually kind of more of an HR thing, not a membership manager. Like it just feels so random, and so I have like a lot of mixed feelings about who should be doing it versus who has skills to help make it happen and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Renae.
I'm curious if other people have that same thing, and to poke at it just a little bit, because I like to poke at things. Is the barrier who owns the design or who owns the whole execution? Because if say a large national membership organization were to create a template climate survey, say a very large, well-resourced membership organization that's investing heavily in diversity and inclusion work right now, perhaps that's an entry point for a lot of institutions that might have people in them feeling that same way. Man?
I think that sounds like a great idea. I used to do the evaluation for the dialogues on inclusivity and decided it wasn't a good idea to evaluate any programs that are just for staff. I focus on the public because every time I get into anything that has to do with staff, I'm someplace where I just don't really want to be. In terms of some of the feedback that you get, it feels like I'm evaluating staff as opposed to evaluating visitors. So it feels like it's this hard area to walk. But what I've started to do is to work with HR to help them do it, and that's worked a little better. But that's just because it just hasn't worked.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a tricky thing deciding who should take ownership of different parts of that process. But I think having like a vetted or outside source saying like, here's the questions. Now, they're being run at different institutions. Try them at yours. I think that would definitely help. Or like Lisa said, having an outside party do this kind of training or climate survey or whatever it is. take some of the pressure off of an internal person who then has to, maybe tiptoe around colleagues when it comes to asking the questions or presenting the data. And Chris just shared a grant opportunity in the sidebar from the IMLS. Chris, do you want to type in real briefly what that opportunity is about? We'll get an answer from her over there. And I think we'll definitely gather up all these links at the end and post them in an email. So it looks like the grant opportunity follows 4 different strands: staff training, I see in the link now, I see that they're all capacity building, professional development, and capacity building opportunities.
Solid.
Yeah. Really good to know about. Yeah, I think, it looks like Lisa has applied too for that one. And following this idea of an outside party or group creating these survey questions for a climate survey or something of that nature, Chris asked earlier if we on the call today could come up with some of these questions. I think she was talking then about questions for visitors, but I think if anyone has an ongoing interest in this, then this might be a group to contribute to that effort.
Yeah. I know that every time AAM does a survey, sometimes before they publish it and sometimes after, they'll now ask our PN for advice on how to word a question about orientation. And so I've sent them the same guidance with the same link to a Williams Institute literature review, I think at least twice now, maybe 3 times. But that's something I have some strong opinions about that I would be happy to validate with others or to share with others. And yeah.
Yeah, maybe are there a couple things that you could just, bullets you could fire off for us here?
I think generically, I would have to turn away from the camera and be super rude and search in my email for the question wording. I won't do that now, but maybe I'll follow up on the emailing and resources. But there's a line to walk between giving people as much opportunity to identify themselves as they self-identify as possible versus having categories that you can work with as an evaluator, as an analyst, right? So having lots of options and other, please describe yourself, or, well, no, I'll take that back. Using the word other is problematic, right? For people who maybe have felt other their whole life, having some outside authority label them as that is challenging. But, or please describe how you identify yourself.
Sorry, that was really helpful.
Orientation and gender identity is another big pro tip, that those are 2 different intersecting identities, even though the acronym kind of lumps them together nowadays. They don't always track together.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. I just wanted to restate what you were saying because that was a really helpful point. So rather than leaving like other as the bottom box to check on a list of possibilities, providing people having the wording or please describe. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
As an alternative.
Yeah. Or whatever is a good alternative in your context to the word other. I think specifically that word can be off-putting or a trigger for people sometimes. And sometimes not. I think I don't know. I get hung up on the word queer as an identifier because that's the one I personally use, but that's very generationally bound. There are people for whom that's a slur. There are people for whom that's absolutely how they think of themselves. in terms of their orientation or in terms of their gender expression. And so it's really muddy. Maybe that's some other good generic advice, is having, if the opportunity involves data collectors on the floor or someone who is available to provide more information or feedback to respondents if they have any questions, having that person or those people conversant about what those words mean, partly to explain them to straight people, partly to be able to parse out what and why they're there for people who might take them more negatively or positively, is interesting. Yeah.
And Chris has added that another alternative to other is that having the option for identified differently as an option that people could check. So it's another good alternative.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what other questions besides, just asking people to identify themselves on a survey, what other questions are useful in general for to hear back from these audiences, and if there are any particularly useful questions about whether or not the museum's welcoming, or open-ended questions. Is there anything? Are there any that any of you can think of, or Renae, ones that you've seen used that you think were really helpful in gathering feedback?
Mm-hmm. I think I should shut up for a minute.
Oh, okay.
You guys go ahead. Or things you wish people were asking, maybe. Is that better if we don't know them from actual experience?
I think, not being from a museum myself, but I can think of lots of generic ones. I'm thinking of the Eiteljorg Museum in Indianapolis. They're a museum of Native American history and Western art. They had an exhibit on the rodeo. It was black and white photographs from the rodeo scene, but specifically from gay men involved in the rodeo, which is a really interesting exhibit. And I can see asking people who came to the exhibit, what should their next exhibit topic be? And just maybe sometimes open-ended things like that would be interesting to hear from audiences.
Yeah.
And Lisa points out that sometimes that her museum would like to know if they're welcoming, but they don't know quite how to gather that information because it's a big general idea. And that's what I was kind of thinking too, like how do we get more specific to find out in what ways is an institution welcoming, or in what ways could it improve?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe let's spitball that for a minute, right? We have some smart people. Like what if we were to break apart the overarching construct of welcoming? Like what could that mean? I can talk about what it means personally as a gender nonconforming queer person, but I don't. Same as I bet most of you, I don't have a ton of experience breaking it apart in a research context. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jen, over in the chat. That what can we stop doing that is we're doing wrong? I think a really big low-hanging fruit there, and I think something you'll see throughout the guidelines as you dive in is sort of defaulting to the heteronormative, right? So bathroom signs are a really good example. Having family memberships that have blanks for mother and father is a really good example. Like if you see an institution doing that, like slap the person, right? Not really, that would get you in trouble, but like point out that's a good example of things to stop doing. Having customer service training for frontline staff that like to the point of spelling it, no, you should engage with that two moms family the same way you would engage with a mom and dad family, or don't presume that the adults in any group, are the parents of all of the kids, right? That kind of thing is an example where being welcoming for LGBTQ audiences tracks really closely with just good customer service and being welcoming to every visitor. And I think there are a lot of things in the guidelines document that kind of fall under that category. And there are other things that are really specific to having an identity that may or may not be visible and that may or may not really affect the way a person walks in the world. Yeah, I think those are big things. And I think those kinds of leaving open the possibility for the inclusion of a curatorial or content narrative that nods to LGBTQ histories or individuals, or the same way it might be a priority for a science institution to include voices of and stories about in the work of female scientists, right? That kind of foregrounding is a good, clean analogy to an art museum foregrounding works by or label text about or context that speaks to the lived experience of a queer artist, and really making those stories visible. Because, one of the things we know is that when you see yourself in the content, you relate to the content, you retain it, you are able to make meaning for yourself from it much more easily. For those of us who live in how learning works in museums, that's a no-brainer. But for people who might be working in museums because they love objects, or because they needed a job, or because they really like raising money for museums, like, people with different skill sets and expertise don't necessarily grok that right away. I said I wasn't going to talk anymore. You guys go for a minute. What else should we be asking about?
I think it's great when you talk. I think all this has been extremely helpful information. So, are there other survey questions that anyone has pondered in their head, or things that they would like to know but don't know how to ask about?
I want to add to what you were saying, that I think sometimes there are things that are more subtle. Like, we have a big family event every year, but it's always scheduled on the same day as Pride, which that's exactly what I do. And so it's like, it's a message, though, to that community that they're not included in that, because it's always on the same time. And so, I don't think we always realize the kinds of things that we do that may not make a group feel welcome. So that's a challenging piece.
Yeah.
And there's something that I heard that COSI did, Renae, maybe you know about it, something that involved taking pictures of things that were welcoming or not welcoming.
No, that's awesome.
That's what came back from AAM, is that COSI took pictures, had the LGBTQ community take photos of things that were welcoming or not welcoming at the museum, and that we should do that. And I was like, well, wait a minute, let's talk about this first. What are we trying to accomplish? But I didn't know if you knew something about that. So they gave them cameras, I guess.
I don't know anything about that, but that's great. That reminds me of things I've heard about where an institution will do a, I've lost the word, but invite people who have different physical or cognitive disabilities to come in and be like critical friend reviewer visitors, right? And give feedback about what different parts of the facility were particularly strong and accessible or challenging in terms of accessibility. That's super cool. I'm glad to know that, Lee. Thank you.
Is there a way for those participants to write comments about why certain aspects are welcoming or not? Or is there some sort of oral or written feedback part?
I don't know. It just came back to me as we heard about this at AAM. We want to do it, but I'm sure that COSI could share that with us.
Cool.
And Chris in the chat mentioned that they have the similar situation at her institution where there's a big event that falls right during Pride. So obviously not just happening in only one place. And she also shared an experience about an after-work hangout where during introductions with coworkers, everyone shared their name, role, and preferred pronouns, which was great. But there were also concerns that it was maybe too much for younger staff who were uncomfortable sharing that information just yet. I think that is a common problem here is we want to talk, openly and acceptingly, but also want to respect people's right to privacy and to not disclosing information about themselves.
Yeah. I think the professional network had a big discussion about this and how whether or not and how strongly we would advocate for having buttons that list people's preferred gender pronouns to put on your name tag at AAM last year. And I don't remember where we settled, but it was a big back and forth between, we want to normalize this versus, one of our trans colleagues in the community was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to own my identity and be myself, and I don't want to broadcast it. And that's, and so then it becomes, the people, there's a stigma attached to not participating in that when it becomes a social consensus. So it's really fraught. I think for I love you all. This is going to sound maybe strange. I think a big benefit to that pronoun sharing habit is that it normalizes the idea of gender diversity for cisgender people, and especially for straight cisgender people who maybe don't know a trans person or don't know a gender nonconforming person or don't know them well, but making it a part of those folks' habits to articulate something that they don't think of consciously about themselves is a really powerful empathy building thing, even though it poses a risk for sometimes an actual risk and sometimes a risk of added stress or anxiety for non-cis people or non-gender conforming people.
This has got me thinking that my husband works in a high school, and these are discussions they have there on a fairly regular basis, it seems. They have training for this type of thing, and so it makes me feel that maybe the rest of us are somewhat far behind if a high school in a not, a liberal town, but not a liberal state of Indiana are doing things like this. It's just some internal reflection on my part.
I don't know. It's really, excuse me, the cynical part of me, which is not insubstantial part of me, that sort of habit or practice is sort of a part of the slow-moving nature of the field in general, right? The same way in which there isn't an evaluator in every museum, the same way there isn't an equity committee in every museum, the same way there isn't community engagement in every museum. Those things are all of a piece with one another. I think to myself in my darker moments. I don't know.
And Chris adds that there's definitely going to be perhaps a long period of uncomfortableness all around that we will have to work through. And I think that she's probably right in that case. We are nearing the end of the hour, and I think this has been a great discussion, and that there's so many good resources to share from this chat, so I'm excited to round those up and send those out. But before we wind up, are there any other topics that people wanted to talk about that we didn't get to touch on? The last questions for Renae? I also want to ask, So, because I feel like there were a lot of good ideas for future possibilities shared around. So, is there anything anybody would like to do following this discussion, or any kind of, I don't want to make anyone promise any big plans that you're not ready to commit to right this moment, but is there anything that we should do as a follow-up to maybe keep the discussion going?
I have a long-term vision that no one else on the professional network really understands. That someone or someones would take some of these practices and validate them from a research standpoint. Right? Like take these recommended practices and do some comparison and think about their efficacy and whether we could be making different or better recommendations. That's like a 20-year project, not a 2-year project. But if it gets anybody feeling fired up, I would love to talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm in the right place to say that.
Definitely. Are you thinking of the Williams Institute recommended practices, or separate ones
from the welcoming guidelines?
From the welcoming guidelines.
Because those are like literally like the visitor research and evaluation section. I wrote that and then I sent it to Joe Heimlich and a couple other people, and they were like, "You should move these around and change this wording, and otherwise it looks good." And that's the extent of the vetting this document has had right now, because it's only just rolling out into professional practice. And so getting some data behind the relative strength of these recommendations beyond just things we know from the literature or from our lived experience can only make them stronger.
I think that's a good question to end on. Something I will try to put that in our follow-up email, so that maybe this will become an email chain of things that will maybe one day lead there. Chris asked, are there researchers we should target who may be willing to take this on? I think off the top of my head, I don't have anything to add in there, but I'm sure that with some digging that we could come up with some.
Yeah. I think, Chris, your last comment is the right comment. Getting this into a grant with an institution where the buy-in exists, and then assembling a team is probably the optimal way to go in terms of feasibility, and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something like what institutions have done around Spanish language interpretation in exhibits or bilingual exhibits.
Well, I think we have someone joining the call. Oh, I have to apologize to you, Laura. You're probably joining now because of my mix-up in communications earlier about the time of the call. So we are just wrapping up, but we have recorded the whole thing and we'll share it with you. And as well as all these great chat questions and ideas that keep coming through. So I am going to go ahead and, if people can stay on, if they'd like to keep chatting, I think I might have to drop off and therefore also stop the recording. But I really appreciate everyone participating today and joining us for this great chat, and especially to Renae and Lisa for helping to organize it, and Renae for being our speaker and introducing us to the guidelines. So thank you so much. Hearts to you as well. We'll be doing another web chat hopefully in August on, I think the topic is bridging communities, so not unrelated to this chat. So maybe you all would like to join us then as well. And just thank you all, and look for an email from me soon where you can get all these great resources that everyone has shared today, and hopefully continue the discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.